as a professor of innovation theory and philosophy of law. He had studied in Graz, Geneva, and at Harvard Law School. And before coming to Innsbruck, he was a project leader in Frankfurt, at the University of Frankfurt, and at the renowned Hans Bredow Institute, at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research in Hamburg. He's still affiliated with the Media Research Institute in Hamburg, where he leads several projects. Matthias is a renowned expert of internet law and internet governance, and this is also what we will be speaking about today. He has published widely in all the renowned journals and with all the renowned publishers on this topic, internet law and governance. And I would like to just draw attention to one particular publication, his book with Oxford University Press, The Normative Order of the Internet, that was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. Open access. Matthias is a big fan of open access, so almost everything Matthias publishes is available open access. And today we'll be speaking about conflict as driver of change in internet governance. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. We're neighboring institutes connected by Clara and common interests, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about an issue which is very dear to my heart. The fundamental question, who can say what we can say online? Who decides about the rules that apply to online communication? And I will talk about three developments: the American elections, the coronavirus, the pandemic, and the recent attack by Putin on Ukraine as drivers of change in the way that we perceive, we accept, we see the responsibilities for online communication. So let me take one step back and talk a bit about the fundamentals of how online communication works. This is a beautiful crowd, an interdisciplinary crowd. So I will first talk about the rules and then the technology that's used to implement those rules for online speech. First of all, what kind of law, what rules apply to what we can say online? Well, depends where you are, depends what you focus on. First of all, there's of course international law. That's law that's applicable everywhere. Fundamental laws are, for instance, related to our human rights. We all have freedom of expression, freedom of communication, independent of borders, independent of the media of our choice. It already says so in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1945. So we have had that right for a long, long time. It's also part of customary law. That is to say, no single state has to formally accept that. It is just something we all have. We all have a right to communication globally, independent of the media we choose to do so, and independent of borders. Now, of course, we always say immediately, well, I mean, but how does that work in practice? Are there limits to that? Yes, there are certain limits to that. You cannot say whatever you want to. You cannot scream fire, as the example goes, in a crowded cinema. You cannot deny the Holocaust in Germany. Well, you can do that in America. You cannot criticize the Thai royal family in Thailand. Well, you can do that in Germany, in Austria. You cannot praise Atatürk. You can praise Atatürk. You cannot praise Kurdish independent leaders in Turkey. Well, you can do that in Germany, in Austria, and France. You cannot. You can deny the existence of the genocide against the Armenians in Austria, but if you do that in Switzerland, you will be punished. So depending on where you are, different rules apply to what you can say, offline and online. But the big difference, and the one area which I want to focus on now, is what additional rules apply to online communication and how they interact with existing rules. So we've had international law, international rules. Most states more or less abide by international law. Of course, we know that sometimes international violations of international law go unpunished. That's true. It's not a perfect order, but then again, lots of bikes get stolen. So also national law is not a perfect order. My bike has been stolen 2 times, and I don't fundamentally distrust the existence of the legal order in Austria. Technically, that was in Germany, but there is law. There's international law that applies to what we can say. In addition, there's of course national law. I've mentioned the examples. Nations, states, can say that they do not want a certain kind of speech, right? The US, for instance, has a very broad approach to what you can say. They do not prohibit the denial of Holocaust, for instance, while a lot of other states, a lot of European states do that. Why? Well, historical reasons for that. A lot of Muslim countries have laws penalizing criticism of Muhammad or even providing images of the Prophet, while that is completely covered by what you can legally say in countries like Austria, like Germany, like the US. So we see already here the first inkling of one of the problems we're having, right? It depends a lot on where you are in the world, what you can say, right? Already in the offline world. And now comes the next dimension. What if, you're in Innsbruck and you're not a particular fan of the Austrian corona measures? What can you do, Can you start a demonstration? Can you paint a little placard in which you write, the coronavirus was invented by Bill Gates and is used to make us all into controllable robots? Can you do that? Can you walk around town with that? Absolutely. I mean, people will think you're stupid, but okay, we have a right to be stupid. There's even an interesting House of Lords judgment saying that people have a right to be stupid. Well, it didn't say so exactly, but that's the gist of it. Okay, so you can do that, right? Or there's a different example. What if you really hate people that eat meat? You think that we have to all subscribe to veganism, we have to stop using so much meat. Are you allowed to say meat kills, don't eat meat? Absolutely, you can say that. You can make a demonstration. I mean, if you want to start, blocking roads to make your point, then usually you'll have to go to the police first and tell them, I want to make a little demonstration. Can I have, part of that road for 15 minutes next week? And usually they say okay, and they route the traffic around it. Okay, so freedom of expression is limited by certain other social considerations. You cannot, start blocking a motorway for 2 days because you don't like meat. But you can express that opinion in offline settings, usually whenever you want, without any particular burden. But now, what about if you're thinking, I really, I want to reach the people where they buy the meat. I want to stop them from buying meat in the first place. Okay, I really want to go to Emprise, the local shop there, and I want to stand in front of the meat aisle, telling people, eating meat is very bad for you. Don't eat meat. What about if you start doing that? What if you have a sign saying, don't eat meat, and you stand in front of the Emprise's meat aisle? What might happen to you? Most likely. At some point, most likely, an employee will come talk to you and ask you, most likely, to leave the premises. What if you don't do that? What if you're standing there? Well, at some point, the person responsible for the shop, the one holding the right to that private premise, will expel you, will throw you out. And if you don't go willingly, what are they going to do? Well, they'll call the police, call help, in order for the public power to enforce their private right to expel you from the premises. So what do we see here? We see that there's a big difference. You're allowed to say meat kills, don't eat meat, in the public space within certain limits, but you're not automatically allowed to say that within a private premise, because within a private shop, because what kind of law applies there? What rules apply in those private entities? Well, primarily, first of all, the private rules of that entity, the speech-related rules of that entity, of that company. We don't think of, Emprise or DM or other shops as, ruling what we can say there, but in fact they are. You're not allowed to say whatever you want to in those private shops, because they can throw you out if you speak in a way that they don't want, if you're drunk, if you create a disturbance. And the same principle, and that's where it becomes slightly more interesting, the same principle applies to private online spaces. And the problem we're now facing is that in the offline world, we accept that distinction, right? We accept that within private premises, it's okay to have certain limits to free speech, because obviously it's they're private spaces, because there's so much open space, so much public space where we can express ourselves, where we can say whatever we want to. And now let's apply that to the internet. Where are the public spaces of the internet? Where are the spaces where you can say whatever you want to? Or perhaps your own homepage, but even that usually doesn't, you might have your own server, right? But at some point you have to contract with a private company, right? You can create your own little internet. I mean, theoretically, of course, there's no such thing as the internet. There are many, many smaller internets, but whom am I telling that? At some point, you need a private company to amplify your speech, I mean, the European Union, for instance, just a couple of weeks ago has created, I don't know whether you've seen that, 2 new social networks, extremely data sensitive, running on Mastodon, called Your Video and Your Voice, I think. Fantastic things, Nobody goes there, obviously, but even there, is it open? Is it public? Well, no, you're still contracting, right? You're subscribing to certain rules, right? And that's the first thing we're all doing when we're joining Twitter or TikTok or Discord or Instagram. What's the first thing we're doing? Well, we're expressing, or we're subscribing to the biggest lie online. What is that? Yes, I've read the terms and conditions. That is the biggest lie. It's not like, the biggest lie is not that, that Trump lost the election or whatever. No, the biggest lie we're all responsible, or we're all participating willingly in, is to say, oh yes, I know the limits of what I can say online. I consciously subscribe to them. All right. So we're entering those private spaces, and we actually know that we are subscribing to their speech rules. We are accepting that their rules apply. But where do those rules come from? Why was it, and I'm using a US example here because it's a bit more interesting, why was it totally okay to deny the existence of the Holocaust until June 21 on Facebook, and from a start of July 21, it got you thrown out of Facebook? Why was it totally okay to deny the effectivity of vaccines until April 2001? And it was an offense that got you thrown out of Facebook and other social networks from April 21 onwards. Why would you have been thrown out of Facebook and Twitter for wishing the death of Putin and calling for violence against Russians before March 22? And from April 22 onwards, you could do that if you were in Ukraine and Georgia. Who decides that? Have there been any public decision-making processes? Any global parliaments deciding that? No, and that's a problem. In American legal history, there's a famous definition of what the law is. And that definition is, the law is what the judge had for breakfast. What is meant by that is that in a country where judges have a strong role in developing the law, you are often very much at the mercy of the decision of the judges. And we have entered an age, 20 years ago, where those judges are the owners of the private spaces. And they're not only the judges, they're also the legislators. And not only the legislators and the judges, they're also the enforcers. So we have, this famous, the famous principle of separation of powers, going back to Montesquieu, where we have legislature setting rules, the executive implementing those rules, and the juries and the courts making sure that the process runs smoothly, and of course, ideally, the fourth estate, the media, watching overall. We don't have that separation of powers on the internet regarding the way that rules are defined, rules are implemented, rules are ruled upon in online spaces. And the funny thing is, even this fourth estate, even the watchdogs, even the media, isn't really there online, because the same companies that have the power to set rules, to enforce those rules, to judge upon the enforcement of those rules, are also the companies that control the way that the media is acting on those spaces. So we have a strong monopolization of power in online spaces. And this has been recognized by researchers for the last 20 years. It has been recognized by states for the last 5 years. And something has happened, I would say, since the last 3 years. And those are those 3 years which I want to focus on for the next 10 minutes. What can we do about this problem? What can we do about this authoritarian reality? Now, we should not assume that companies are necessarily bad, right? We should not assume that the goal of Instagram, of Twitter, of Telegram is to have negative effects on society. It's not their goal. But the problem is that for a long time, they haven't cared enough about possibly having negative effects to remedy them, to do something about them. They were oriented towards something else. And what was that? I mean, they're companies, so obviously, well, making money, gaining leverage, extending market share. How do you do that? Well, you have to make your own space attractive. And you can either do that by actually being attractive or by developing rules and implementing them in a way that makes your platform very sticky, right? And there's lots of psychological research on how to do that. I'm not going to, I'm not a big expert on the psychology of designing platforms, but platforms they invest a lot of money. That is their business model. The business model is, to have people stay on long enough. Also because obviously, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is what's the product they're selling, those platforms? What is the product that, that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are selling? Is it a nice social media space? No. The product is we, us. You are the product. I'm the product. The actual customers are the big companies that want to, sorry, did I mess up the careful camera setting? No, we are the product of those companies, We are the product. And they want to keep us just moderately happy, We're a bit like, the farmers of the old days before the ecological revolution would deal with pigs, They have to be sort of fed, right? So they shouldn't quite die immediately, They have to be kept alive long enough, to be harvested and to be sold off, right? So we have to be kept, happy enough to stay long enough there to produce data which they can then sell on to advertisers, right? So that's what they designed their rules for, and that's what they optimized their algorithms for. Why do automated decision-making systems play a role here? Well, we have to ask ourselves, how is online communication managed? Are there people sitting somewhere and clicking on whether this video is okay, whether that video violates some rules? Yes, also, there are some people, by now a couple of thousands, or a couple of tens of thousands, often underpaid, often in places like the Philippines, Tunisia, India, where they do speak English, but where the level of pay is much lower. They're responsible for weeding through some of the nastiest bits of online communication, which leads to tremendously bad effects on their health, their mental health. There's a film called The Cleaners on that. It's horrible. But of course, people are just not able to digest the huge amount of information uploaded every single second. The numbers are astounding. There are thousands of hours uploaded, millions of hours even every single second on the different media sites. Of course, people can't deal with that. So you need automated content governance systems. And if you excuse my use of my slightly untechnical use of the notion of algorithm, when we in law talk about algorithm, we mean the way that online content mechanisms are being organized or being implemented. When we talk about algorithmic transparency, we mean we have to know more about how platforms deal with those automated decision-making systems. What are they optimized for, right? What have the algorithms of those platforms been optimized for in the past? Well, keeping the product mostly happy and online, right? Engaging us, Oh, so you're interested in homeopathy? Well, that's interesting. People who dislike, medicine also, or dislike, traditional medicine, who dislike, classical medicine, also find that side interesting. Where people congregate and say that perhaps the election has been stolen, right? Or oh, you're interested in the stories about the big lie that Trump's election was stolen. You might also be interested in those sites telling you about how everything is a Jewish conspiracy and things like that. So you get the automated decision-making systems. Again, they're not designed to produce bad results. They're designed to be self-optimizing, right? And the decision-making system, the automated decision-making system, learns to get better and better by optimizing, by being optimized for increasing engagement. And you increase engagement, you know, by giving people things they want, or they think they want, or they even don't think they want them, but they actually do want them. And and this whole process, you know, the rule setting, the rule implementation, the ruling on the rules, and the way that they're enforced has been left for far too long in the hands of those companies. And the first time that really brought the problem to to the world's attention was the last, well, actually the second but last, but also the last US elections, when both sides, both parties noticed how much of an influence foreign influence operations could have. Now, empirically, it's extremely hard to track how much influence any online influence operation can have. But the mere fact that this was such a point everybody talked about, it was plainly in the center of the discourse on the way that the elections were waged, had the result that since the last big US elections, the way that online content governance takes place has been a political mainstay. So people on the right and the left side of the political aisle in the US, and the US is still extremely important for the way that the internet is being run globally, have been talking about online content moderation as a huge problem, right? They mean different things, right? So the right says they're getting cancelled. The left says, you know, that they don't like big companies anyway. So both of them, I'm slightly condensed in my identification of the problem. Both sides are agreeing that something has to be done. However, the US is currently in a position where constructive, sustainable solutions to complex societal problems is difficult to achieve due to the polarized nature. And we can talk, of course, at length about the question of whether social media contributed to that polarized discourse. Most likely much less than everybody thinks. It's also legacy media. It's also the political reality since the last 60s. So since the 1960s. So it's a mixed bag. But a lot of people are invested in saying that it's social media that did all of the polarization. You know, Fox News, for instance, is a big fan of shifting the blame towards social media. So be careful a bit about saying that it's social media that caused polarization. It contributed, but it's difficult to assess how much exactly. But that shouldn't stop us from considering how to make social media better. The second big step was, so with the US elections, companies started to realize that it's not a good thing if everybody believes that they are contributing or that they are sort of falsifying democratic processes or influencing democratic processes. They didn't have a problem with that at all before, you know. Obama, for instance, Obama used social media very successfully. And at that time, during the first Obama campaign, nobody, you know, talked about, you know, the problem, you know, of social media impacting democratic decision-making processes. You know, everybody was extremely happy. Oh, so you're using big data to identify the people you want to talk to? Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. How do you do that? You know, everybody's so happy. And his approaches, you know, the people involved in his campaigns, you know, they came to Europe then and then were sort of hailed as the big, you know, the future of political decision making, right? So we have changed a lot, right? We no longer see this, you know, this potential detailed, granular approach using big data via social platforms to influence people as being a good thing. And this has been one of the reasons, the US elections, the last ones, have been one of the reasons for that. So platforms realized it's not a good thing if everybody thinks they can change elections, right? Which they can't, but still it's about the perception. And then came Corona, right? And with Corona, platforms suddenly realized something else. Namely, it's probably also not a good thing if they contribute actively to lots of dead people, right? You know, their children, dead people, they're just not, you know, not a good business model, right? So they said, well, okay, so let's do a bit, right? So let's, for instance, start at least by by curtailing some of the worst disinformation related to vaccines. Let's at least stop people from saying that vaccines don't work. Could they have done that before? Absolutely. Could they have stopped the re-emergence of some preventable childhood illnesses in some parts of the US over the last couple of years? Absolutely. But they didn't. Why? Well, there was no incentive to do that. There was not enough public pressure, and there was not enough, societal. The global civil society was just not, not critical enough. People didn't realize we could be critical of the way that platforms deal with content. So Corona changed a lot of that, and the current war changed even more because two things happened. The European Union, and I'll talk about in the last section, which will be happy and future-looking, I promise. The European Union very early on prohibited certain Russian programs and told platforms to also deplatform them, so to throw them out. Right? So European Union decision makers recognized that part of this information conflict, the information warfare is happening on social media platforms. And they have, this process started 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when the European Union installed something called the EU versus Disinfo unit. It's part of the European External Action Service, and they're actively fighting against Kremlin-related disinformation. And nobody paid much attention to them over the last 6 years, right? There's a unit that has been identifying and countering Kremlin-based disinformation in Europe for the last years. EU versus disinfo.org, I think. And nobody noticed, right? Nobody cared, right? And now suddenly everybody did care. And then the European Union went along in a more or less a procedure within a couple of days, said, well, for the first time, we're going to prohibit certain media outlets from being used. We're going to prohibit them from being given a platform on social media. And we can do that because we believe that the societal ills which they produce are bigger than the risks in curtailing the freedoms. Right? So, with this development, with the election, with the pandemic, with war, we've seen a completely new landscape. The threat landscape has developed, and with that, the opportunity landscape for all of us. And why? This is where the forward-looking fun part starts. I'm a happy person, a mixture between German and Austria, so it means I'm both punctual and I know more than 2 jokes. And this is sort of the fun part, right? So what is going to happen now? What is happening now, right? So as I've said, we can't expect much from the US. They're sort of inward-looking currently. Who can we expect something from? Well, Brussels, the European Union. The European Union has been very effective in regulating online platforms for the last years. Data protection was one of the issues they started with. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has been a global success. We called it the Brussels effect and trace the impact of that regulation globally. The current California Consumer Privacy Bill is basically a copy of the GDPR. So we can expect good things from Brussels. And the good thing is that a lot of things happened already. Over the last month, we've had 2 beautiful new proposals for rules that are going to fundamentally change the way that platforms are regulated. These are the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, DSA and DMA. And those 2 acts together will help us recalibrate the power of platforms. They're not going to fundamentally alter the communication landscape. They're not going to fundamentally alter how power is being exercised online, but they're going to contribute, and I believe substantially, to a more rule of law-based online communication order. Just quickly, and I'm happy to go more into detail later on, what are they doing? So the Digital Services Act says, to your platforms, yes, you can set your own rules. That's okay. We're not going to infringe upon that. Also, the European Union couldn't infringe upon that because the majority of the things which they could prohibit would be something that only national law could prohibit. The European Union has only limited competence. For instance, they can invent new criminal rules. That's something that only states can do, right? So the European Union rules say, your platforms, you can continue to have your own rules, but you have to implement them in a rule of law-based way. You have to follow procedures which you share with us. You have to tell us about the rules. You have to provide internal recourse mechanisms. If somebody's content is deleted, well, that person has to have a recourse. First inside the platform, then outside, and then they can go to the courts, which is happening all of the time in Germany and Austria and France. It's not happening in the US because in the US, well, platforms can do basically whatever they want to under the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So under the Digital Services Act, this new law, platforms are now on a much more tighter control. And how is that control implemented? Well, through transparency obligations. Platforms have to report what kind of content they delete, how often they delete content, how they react when content that is illegal under national law is being notified to them. And in addition, we will still continue to have some of the national laws that have strict time limits. For instance, Germany's Network Enforcement Act, Austria's Communications Platform Act, both provide 24-hour limits for platforms to delete clearly illegal content and 7-day limits to delete only regularly illegal content. So those are going to stick, right? In addition to those transparency rules, there's something really cool, which is algorithmic transparency. Platforms will have to provide, we're not quite sure yet how, but we've still got a year or so to work on that, provide users with insight into the logic of algorithmic recommender systems. So, much cleverer people than I, people from the informatics, computer science, will have to think about, together with design people, together with lawyers, on how to do that. How do you provide people, how do you provide regulators insight into the logic of algorithmic decision-making systems, right? And the thing is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. This rule has been on the European books for the last 5 years. Article 22 of the GDPR says anybody whose data is being processed purely automatically has a right to being told about the logic of that algorithmic decision-making system that's processing their data. Has anybody heard of that before? Even lawyers have no idea about that rule. The comments in the most comments is really short, because nobody implements that. And why? Well, because companies are clever. They'll say, of course, the automated decision-making system isn't only making the decision themselves. There's always a human somewhere, pressing an OK. Then it's no longer an automated decision. All right. And what else? Platforms have to conduct risk assessments. Platforms have to share with the European Union's regulatory bodies. There'll be a sort of a digital services body that combines, that sort of does a bit of oversight. They have to share with that body reports on how they deal with threats emanating from their platform for democracy. They have to share, for instance, how they deal with disinformation, because too much disinformation can impact democratic processes negatively. It can impact public health negatively. So they have to share all that with the platforms. And combined with the Digital Markets Act, this is going to help us curtail the powers of those platforms. The Digital Markets Act, very briefly, tells especially the big gatekeepers, the owners of app stores, for instance, or the owners of marketplaces like Amazon, like Apple, like Google, that they cannot use that power to hold down the little guys, to hold down the small and medium enterprises, to steal their data, to, like Amazon does, to change, to first look what products sell well, then do the same product and throw the smaller enterprises out of the market, Or Apple is no longer allowed to say you can only pay, use the App Store payment facility, and it will take 1/3 of anything that you get, So obviously here too, just as we as users are protected more against the autocratic tendencies of platforms through the Digital Services Act, smaller and medium enterprises will be protected more against autocratic practices by platforms, by big platforms, by gatekeepers, through the Digital Markets Act. And the idea is the same, It's making sure that this idea that we fought revolutions for, that those in power have checks and there's some sort of balances. We fought revolutions for that. The French Revolution, for instance, and some smaller Austrian and German revolutions. We're not that big on revolutions. Anyway, so this idea, power has to be checked, power has to be balanced, is something which we have forgotten over the last 20 years, and we're just currently in the process of injecting that idea into the way that that rules apply to platforms and to markets. And concluding with one thought. All this, is sort of, it's going to the right direction slowly, right? But one fundamental question remains. The one area which all of those rules don't actually relate to or apply to is the rules that platforms set themselves. You know, the priorities they give certain content over other, right? The decisions they take, what kind of content they want to amplify and whatnot, right? And I think we should ask ourselves at this point the revolutionary question: don't we want to have more impact and more input as people on those processes? Don't we also want to take part in setting the rules and defining how those rules are being implemented? Don't we want more power? Don't we want to take some of the power back? And if we do want that, and I would strongly argue that we do, how do we do that? Do we need platform councils, platform parliaments? How can we redefine what democracy means in this age? And we do need to do that, because just as we need to make sure that we do enough against climate change today to provide a livable world for our children and their children, we have to make sure that also the political climate change doesn't result in a society that is no longer cohesive, and that will make life miserable for our children and their children. So we have to do more now, and we can only do that in an interdisciplinary approach. And that's why I think organizations and institutions like the Digital Science Center are so important, because you have the greatest minds of this generation working together in an interdisciplinary setting on those burning problems. And I'm very happy to be able to have shared some of my thoughts here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for a great presentation. Thank you for making this so accessible, also to non-lawyers. I saw people smiling and nodding along. That's a very good sign. I know as a lawyer how difficult it is to make things accessible to non-lawyers. You use so many examples. This works very well, I feel. We have questions now from